Daisy.
And I'm Terry.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 190.
And this week, it's Daisy's turn to share something with us. Daisy, what do you have?
Well, Terry, I was pondering, my mind was wandering all over the place this morning when I was out with my dogs. It was a dog field day, so I could actually let my mind wander more than the other days when I need to be a bit more focused. As you know, I'm on separate walks with this reactivity protocol with Lila. I have to take her separately and then take the others. And especially when I'm taking her, I have to be quite focused on what I'm doing. I was laughing, telling my mother the other day, there are all these different things I have to do to stop her getting a reaction, basically. And if things get really bad and we go to DEFCON 1, I have to pick her up and run. And that was the situation I found myself in over the weekend. We found ourselves dogs coming up behind us, dogs on one side, dogs on the other side. There was nothing to do but pick her up and run, which is what I did. But anyway. It was an easier morning today because we were at the dog field, so they can all just run around and my mind can wander. And I remember how much I used to do this on dog walks. I would just ponder on things. So anyway, it got me thinking about breaking old habits, creating new habits, and building a different identity for ourselves that so many of us embark on at this time of year. As listeners to this podcast will know, we're not great fans of the old New Year's resolution type approach, but a lot of people do that, and we see a lot of people around us doing that. And to a certain extent, actually, I quite often fall into that. There is a bit of that new year, new start to a certain extent. But it is that time of year, isn't it, when a lot of people are trying to make these kind of changes. And we also picked up last week on how easy it is to fall by the wayside if you don't build that really strong foundation. And you talked very eloquently about the importance of building strong foundations, putting down strong roots so that you could weather storms as they blow through. You gave us some great practical tips from Jonathan, can't remember his surname. Can you put you on the spot here?
Jonathan Fields, that's the one. And he had his ABCs, conviction, bravery and awareness. And intentionally did it backwards there because that's how he did it. But I particularly like the first part, the conviction, and the 5 whys you talked about to help build that really strong foundation. And we've often talked about James Clear, BJ Fogg and others too about when it comes to building the new habits. But as I was reflecting on what I've been doing with Lila, it got me thinking how some of the same principles apply to us. You know how much I like to talk about my dogs. But Janine, the wonderful behaviourist I work with, she's a bit like Terry for dogs. She's a behaviourist and she comes very much from the perspective of what is best for the dog. And she really gets inside their head and comes from that perspective. So pretty much all reactivity, and I think probably most of us have come up against these kind of dogs. Certainly before I got Lila, just walking my dogs, we would often pass half a dozen of these kind of dogs. You know, the kind of dogs that you have to cross the road to avoid, or rather their owners quickly cross the road to avoid you because their dog is reacting usually to your dog. With Lila, it was more traffic actually, but some dogs as well. But they react and they can react in different ways, but they quite often go nuts, barking. You know, she would turn and bite the lead and it got to biting me and trying to bite the other dogs and barking and lunging. And like I say, most of us, we've seen dogs doing this. But where does that come from? It comes from fear and anxiety. So when you see, and I did make the mistake of having a look on YouTube, but when you see things like lead correction being used to try and solve this problem of reactivity, what they're doing is adding more fear and pain into the mix. And so how is that a good thing for the dog? It's not to say it doesn't work, in quotation marks, but at what cost, Janine would say.
Anyway, the first step that was crucial with Lila was to calm everything down. Apparently, with all this anxiety going on, the pheromones are going wild and you've got to bring them back to a base level. So the protocol started with her. She went on the same calming tablets that Rocket's on. They're natural. It's valerian and skullcap, natural tablets they take, which just helps with sleep, because to empty this stress bucket, they have to get 16 hours of good quality sleep a day. Otherwise, they're starting the next day with their stress bucket full to whatever degree. And before you know it, it's overflowing again. So you've got to get it back to this base level. So she had to start taking the tablets, and she had to have 7 to 10 days. It ended up being 10 days at home, no walks, because we got to have no reaction at all, no reaction to any of the triggers. And that means staying at home. But if you think about it, how can you start trying to train a dog or a person towards a new habit when they're stressed out of their minds all the time? You mentioned dread in the last episode, and this is something I'm very familiar with. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are, but dread and overwhelm and anxiety. Well, imagine being so stressed and full of dread that you can't sleep properly, and how that feels day after day, the accumulation of that day after day after day. Then imagine someone comes along and insists you stop doing something that you've been doing that, at least in your mind, is a safety defense mechanism. And instead, they want you to do something new, something completely different, that is basically facing your fears head on, and you just got to do it anyway. Well, how do you think they're going to react? It's not going to go well, is it?
Yeah.
So this got me thinking about the importance of elimination diets, resets, back to basics, whatever you want to call it. But a strict basic protocol that drops the inflammation and gets you to a calm baseline. And I'm talking, of course, about, because most of our listeners are in this area, when you're trying to make a change to your diet, to your lifestyle. But only then can you start building from the ground up. And there are things we can do, maybe things we can use to help calm, just like Rocket and Lila with their calming tablets. The different things that we talk about during this period, like electrolytes and fluids, and maybe a long soak in a bath, some meditation, breathing, focusing on your sleep, dropping those anxiety levels as much as possible. And only then can you go on. And the second step with Lila and this protocol is exposure and conditioning and proofing. But maybe I'll talk about that next time. I wanted to keep it as quite a quick one, because we've had quite a lot of long episodes recently. But I just thought this was quite a key, if rather simple, thing to focus on. And of course, just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy. I was interested in your experience of this with clients you've worked with in the fasting method community, your own personal experience. But I think I've certainly talked a lot about, when you're changing your diet and your lifestyle, do you go sort of all in at the beginning, or do you drop down in stages? Where the habit building, I think, is really probably best done in stages, talking about people like James Clear and BJ Fogg and their small steps. But, in the past, I've argued for and against, really, whether you go with this sort of elimination diet and you really go cold turkey, or whether you go down in stages. But I thought it was quite interesting with this perspective, with this reactivity protocol I'm doing with Lila. This key fundamental first stage is so important that you can't do the training, you can't do the changing the habits until you've done that. And it just made me think about it from that perspective for when we're trying to make these big changes, as to how actually can you tackle setting up these new habits, these new behaviors, this new way of eating, this new lifestyle that you want if you're full of anxiety and stress and inflammation. And so coming from that point of view, it sort of tipped the scales even more to thinking that this really getting back to a clean, calm baseline, how important that might be. Again, tying back into what you were saying last week, of getting that foundation really strong.
Mm-hmm. I wish there was one simple answer, as you kind of identified people. You could argue either side of it. I wonder, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but almost a middle approach in that, how do we reduce, and I know these are different things about the reactivity in a dog versus someone's habits around food, but how do you alleviate or bring down the tension level, the anxiety level, while making changes that can be triggering? And so as I was thinking about it, in that example, I might work on one habit change at a time, not clearing the whole slate and trying to build all 10 new habits at the same time, because that just sounds so overwhelming. And so, gosh, this is such an interesting question. I'm just thinking maybe an example, pick the behavior that you think, and this is the way I usually describe it, either the behavioral change that you will get the most benefit from, or the easiest one to do first. So let's say, for example, when I first started changing how I was eating, I didn't know anything about fasting. So I wasn't trying to change my food and start this new fasting behavior at the same time. I learned them separately. So by the time I learned how to fast, a lot of my tension around the food and the physiological responses to the food had already quieted down significantly before starting that new behavior. Rather than so many people that I work with right now, you're really trying to make a couple of big changes all at once. And so it might help us to think about putting more emphasis on one, and again, maybe the one that causes the least tension or relieves the most tension. So let's say, for example, someone says, I've got 5 food-related patterns that I think are really problematic and are going to need to change in order for me to reach my weight loss goals or to reach my health goals. Okay, which one could you feel most comfortable doing first? Or which one will help the other ones more? So of course, for a lot of people, it's sugar. Should I focus all of my energy on stopping sugar? Should I focus my energy on building a better platform so that when I'm ready to stop sugar, I've got a better chance of achieving it? I really wish this was an example where there was one right answer. I am a big believer in, depending on what the changes are, who the person is, where they are in their health journey, in their personal life, all of those things, all of those factors might influence how I would recommend they start first. It's not that I would give everyone the exact same plan. You know, some people, they're going to work on getting rid of sugar first, because once that's out of the way, everything else works so much better for them. But for others, that in and of itself is so challenging and so, triggering for them that everything else just kind of stays really messy in that process. So I wish I had an easier answer for this, Daisy, but I really think this is one of those that, again, it depends on what it is that you're working on changing and what's going on with you at the time. When I first changed how I was eating, I started with the Whole30. I don't know that I could do that now in my life in the same way that I did then. Just the way my life was set up, I lived alone. I could clear out every item of food in that house that didn't fit the Whole30 approach, which I did. That would be a lot harder for me to do now. I would have to be navigating someone else and what food's in the house for both of us and things. So in that example, the all or nothing approach actually worked best for me, but I don't know that I would use that same approach now if I were doing that same thing.
Yes, that's very true, actually. And I suppose the way I was pondering it was really thinking, I suppose I was reflecting back on my own experience, and I was tying in that, the thinking along the lines of what was happening with Lila, of this importance of getting to this calm baseline to start with. And I was thinking of the comparison of that to dropping the inflammation right down, dropping all those cravings and things right down. And really the only way I've ever found to do that is cutting everything out for a period of time. And it's really hard, but then it's so much easier. And it felt to me very, very similar in getting down to that calm baseline, because all the other things tend to fall with it. So the anxiety and the stress and everything tends to sort of fall down with it. But yes, you're right. It is obviously so different for different people. And I think just something that you said there is, and again, it's tying back in. I thought it felt like a really nice follow on from last week, with really drilling down on these whys, and maybe, asking yourself some whys, figuring out what's going to get the biggest bang for your buck. What is going to be the one thing that you could do that could get you as close as possible to that first week, 10 days of Lila's protocol, of calming the system down enough that you can then start trying to build new habits.
Mm-hmm.
I think the point I was trying to get across, the point that was coming to me, the sort of big takeaway I had from it was that you can't try and make these changes. You can't try and build new habits. You can't try and cement a new identity. You can't build that foundation if you're stressed out of your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not just how we think about, the typical feeling of stress, but you have all this stuff going on in your body that's like the anxiety with Lila, that the only outlet for it was this reaction, which is like a toddler having a tantrum. You've got no way for it to come out. But how can you expect somebody to adopt new habits, to be in a place capable of doing that, if everything is so physically and mentally?
It also reminds me of another, I hope this fits, but I remember years ago I attended this, it's a weekend workshop, and I attended it twice. And it was for someone who was teaching from a functional medicine perspective, a detox program. And I know we hear all kinds of detox and use this product and use this and use chlorella and you do this. But when you really thought about, you understood why detoxing was so important, because you could see all the ways it was holding someone's health back physically, mentally, emotionally. But when you then go through the detox, and this was a supplement-based detox, not a dietary-based detox. But the first, I don't remember how long it was, but the first portion was you took supplements to build the parts of your body that were going to do all the heavy lifting. So they were liver support, kidney support, helping get these in really good shape before you did anything else, getting this good setup. There were 3 stages really. And in the 3rd stage, you were really getting into detoxifying the brain. But you can't detoxify the brain when the rest of the body's not working.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like there was an order to the steps. And I hear that with your training with Lila. You can't teach her this thing while she's in this total state of arousal. You had to first clear all of that arousal, all of that stress, so that there's space for this new stuff. So I definitely think There are other examples. I'm sure there are other examples that we could come up with of that. Sometimes it's not just go in whatever order you want or do it all at once, but there really is a progression that you need this step first to lay the groundwork, get a firm, solid, clear basis. Then add this part in. Now you've got these beginning pieces. And there may even be a third place. I'm sure it's somewhere along this way with you and Lila. It's about creating the trust between the two of you so that she leans on you and trusts you and takes direction from you. But she can't do that while she's so reactive and just in survival mode. So you're laying the groundwork so that the next level is possible, which builds a spot for the next level.
Exactly. And imagine if I add to her anxiety by using, I watched a video, I didn't watch it for long, where he used lead correction and he pulled the dog so hard that it yelped. This was an advisory video from a dog trainer. I'm like, wow. You imagine if Lila, she's so stressed that she's freaking out, and I added that into the mix.
Yeah.
And then, you'd be surprised if she turned around and bit a chunk out of my leg. You wouldn't be, would you, really?
And are there other situations where using lead correction is the right step? Perhaps, because that dog may be at a place where they're in a safe enough place psychologically that they can take that feedback. But in the reactivity place, adding in another stressor is going to create more reactivity and worsen the problem. And so again, it's not one size fits all. There might be, in this example, some dogs, based on what they're experiencing and what's going on with them, that this strategy might actually be helpful.
Well, that's a whole interesting other debate that, that Janine would say, definitely not ever. Yeah, she has a very interesting history in that she came much more from that background because it does work. It works. But is it in the best interest of the dog? And that's where she's coming from now. But that's a whole other conversation. But I just thought it was interesting, and I just thought, just be a little bit kind with yourself. And I wonder if that is quite often why people end up trying to make these changes at this time of year, actually. I know it's not the middle of winter everywhere in the world, but for a lot of places, we're just after, we're in that sort of lull in between, after a holiday season, before the build up to summer or before the build up to other things. And I think it's quite often a handy chunk of the year where people are happy to sort of maybe dedicate some time to doing an elimination diet or a very strict diet or going back to basics or starting a new exercise regime or whatever it is. It's quite often when they have the space to do it, actually. It's not so much the whole fixated on New Year's resolutions. It's more that it's a convenient time of year, I think, for a lot of people, which adds to why it crops up so much about now. But again, just coming from a slightly different perspective, me, it's always looking through the dog perspective, but it just got me thinking. I thought it might be another interesting thing to think about, especially building on last week's interesting episode.
Absolutely. And we could probably do 5 more episodes, and each one just a little bit of a different perspective, because as we've already highlighted today, there may not just be one way that we should be approaching all of these type of goals, depending on where we are, what works best for our kind of personality type, just like what works best for what dog type or state of stress, state of calm, state of wellness. I think it is really then a reminder that it is not, any of these things are not just one size fits all. Here's how to do it, go do it. Everyone gets the same result. That we really have to, and I like that you said kind of showing self-compassion. I know even in my work, so many times clients are like, okay, but I've just got to start fasting more. And I'm like, no, actually, this is not the time for you to fast more. That is not going to be as helpful to you right now as bringing down these places of tension for you or whatnot. Getting this set up well first before turning up that fasting dial. But it would be so easy to say, I just want to correct my dog from doing this, so I'm going to do the lead correction. Well, in this case with Lila, that's going to make things worse. So that's not the best strategy. So yeah, I think it just really kind of reminds us there's not one right way. And actually, Daisy, it's one of the things that I think we do here at this podcast. We're not ever, I don't think, saying this is the only way to think about this, because then 2 weeks later, we've got another person's perspective that shows us another angle.
Exactly.
And then it's like, oh yeah, and sometimes this is going to be a better approach. So look out, folks. We're going to keep coming back to you with some of these same themes because there are so many different ways to approach things.
And you know what it's like. I know it's this way for me, and I'm sure it's the way for you. If you're trying to make a change, you kind of have to hear it from the right person in the right way. And that's not going to be the same for you, for me, for somebody else. Mm-hmm. It might be the timing that you hear this exactly the same message hits you at the right time, but more often than not, it's just said in a slightly different way, coming from a slightly different perspective, that it suddenly makes sense. It's like, oh yeah, I get it. That makes sense. I could go with that. Mm-hmm. So there you go.
Very good.
So if the dog training method works for you, give it a go. I'm sure I'll be back before long again, talking about my dogs. You know me, can't help myself.
Well, here's the other thing, though, that you're learning, Daisy, that this strategy so far is helping. Improvements are happening.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And had you used strategies that you had learned, with previous dogs, you may not be seeing this progress because Lila's different. Her background is different. Her internal response to things is different than other dogs.
And luckily she's small and quite light, so I can go to DEFCON 1 and pick her up and run.
There you go.
Because at all costs I have to avoid a reaction, because if I get a reaction, I have to go back to step 1. Yeah. So that's what we're trying to avoid. And it involves lots of chicken and dehydrated liver and sometimes me running.
It's so good there you for go. Both of you.
It is. It absolutely is. Unfortunately, the sun is shining. We haven't had rain for a while. It's freezing cold. The bobble hat has come out, but it's actually nice weather to be walking dogs. So it's been much more enjoyable. Well, until next time, another week's worth of dog walks. I hope you have a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everybody.